Hello everyone. Before we start, hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is for you. That's how YouTube keeps sending you stories like this. And now, let's get into it. I went to Alaska because my father died there. He had never talked about the place with any affection. Alaska was never a dream to him. It was a calculation. He followed pipeline shutdowns, refinery expansions, winter emergency contracts. He chased per diem and overtime and hardship pay. He went where other men didn't want to stay long. Cold places, remote places. Places where you worked until your hands hurt, and then worked some more because the clock was still running. When the Coast Guard called, they said his skiff had been found drifting near the edge of a tidal channel. No body. No radio call. No flare. Just the boat, scraped and weathered, with his boots tied together inside it. The knots were neat. He was precise with knots. That detail stuck with me more than anything else. My mother shut down the moment the call ended. She didn't cry. She didn't ask questions. She said she was done talking to anyone official. I took unpaid leave because someone had to go. Someone had to stand in front of people and look them in the eye. Someone had to see the water where he disappeared. The village sat on a narrow spit of land that felt temporary, like it had only been tolerated by the sea. There were no trees, just wind and damp ground and piles of rotting kelp pushed high by tides. Rusted fuel tanks stood on stilts. Houses leaned into the weather, patched with mismatched boards and tarps. Everything smelled of salt, diesel, and decay. People were polite. They offered nods, help carrying bags, short explanations about where things were. No one lingered. No one asked why I was there unless it became unavoidable. When I said my father's name, they reacted with practiced neutrality. Some nodded. Some looked past me. A few shifted their weight and found excuses to leave. The explanation was always the same. Men go missing sometimes. They said it calmly, as if it were a seasonal issue. The tone was the same one people use for taxes or mechanical failure. It happens. You adjust. You don't dwell. I rented a small room above the old co-op store. The building had been half converted, half abandoned. My room smelled like dust and old cardboard. The windows rattled all night. When the wind picked up, it felt like the walls flexed inward. At night I heard movement beneath the floor. Not footsteps. Not scurrying. Something slow. Dragging. The sound of pressure moving across wood. It came in long intervals, then stopped, then resumed. When I asked about it, people said it was probably sea lions under the pier. That made sense on paper. It did not match the sound. What bothered me more than the noise was the behavior around the water. The village shut down at dusk. Boats were pulled in early. Traps were checked at first light only. No one stood on the shore after dark. Lights stayed dim. Curtains stayed closed. One man told me that the sea listens when the ice starts forming. He did not explain further. He did not need to. I spent my days walking the shoreline, watching the tides, reading old notices posted near the harbor office. My father's name appeared in a few places. Work permits, fuel purchases, a short-term dock rental. He had been there longer than he usually stayed. Long enough to become familiar. The skiff was stored behind a warehouse, chained to a post. Seeing it felt wrong. The paint was chipped in the same places I remembered. The motor casing still had a dent from years earlier. It smelled like old oil and salt. Nothing about it looked damaged enough to explain a disappearance. I took it out one morning when the weather stayed flat and gray. The engine started on the first pull. That unsettled me. I followed the channel markers out into open water. The sea looked calm but never still. There was always movement under the surface, a constant shifting. I leaned over the side to check the net line he had left rigged. The smell hit me before I saw anything. It was sweet and metallic, almost coppery. Not fish, not fuel. It clung to the air. That was when I noticed the scrape marks along the gunwale. Parallel grooves cut deep into the fiberglass. They ran inward, angled slightly toward the stern. They were not from docking. They were too evenly spaced. Too deliberate. Something had pulled itself against the side with force. I brought the skiff back and started asking different questions. Not about storms or currents, about conflicts, about work disputes, about debts, about who controlled access to certain fishing areas and contracts. The answers were slow, incomplete. Some people avoided me outright. Eventually, patterns emerged. My father had been asking questions himself. He had noticed traps being cleared without permits. He had noticed fuel going missing. He had noticed boats operating at night when no one else would. He was not a quiet man when he thought something was wrong. The water here hid things easily. The tides were strong. The channels shifted. A body could disappear without effort. The boots mattered because they removed doubt. Boots don't float away together by accident. They are removed or placed. I learned that there had been other boats found empty over the years. Not many. Enough to be dismissed individually. Enough to form a shape when lined up. I learned that certain men controlled the docks after dark. That they used the fear of the water to keep others away. That accidents were convenient. That explanations never reached beyond the village. My father had gone out early. He had likely confronted someone on the water. A skiff sits low. It takes little effort to destabilize it. A heavy pull alongside. A sudden shift. Cold water ends strength quickly. A body sinks fast when weighed down by clothing. The boots had been tied together because boots float. They had been placed in the skiff to suggest choice. A man removing them voluntarily. A man stepping into the sea. It gave the story closure without proof. 3 weeks after I left, the boots washed up again. This time they were placed neatly on shore. Toes pointed inland. The knots were different. Cruder. A message delivered by someone who wanted the matter closed. By then I understood. The village survived by agreement. Silence kept things working. The sea did the rest. I returned home with paperwork and photos and notes that went nowhere. No agency pursued it. No charges were filed. There was no appetite for tearing open a place that functioned by not being examined. My mother did not ask what I found. She only asked if I was done. I was. I still think about the sound under the floorboards at night. Not because I believe it was anything unnatural, but because it reminded me how pressure moves when it has weight behind it. How something dragged leaves marks. How water hides effort and violence better than land ever could. My father did not vanish. He was removed. The sea did not take him. People did. And the water made sure no one had to say it out loud. I took the Dalton Highway job because it paid more than anything else I could get with my record, and because it was far enough north that nothing from my life could follow me there. Seasonal maintenance sounded clean on paper. Plowing, grading, clearing debris, checking culverts. In reality, it meant 12 to 14 hours a day in weather that punished mistakes and nights where the dark pressed against the buildings until sleep felt like a favor. The money came fast. So did the exhaustion. That balance kept me from thinking too much. There were 4 of us assigned to that stretch. We lived in a prefab unit set back from the road, anchored with steel cables and half buried in snow berms. The place smelled like wet boots, fuel, and reheated food. The walls flexed when the wind came down from the Brooks Range. I slept alone because my breathing got loud when I was tired, and because I didn't want to explain anything about myself. I learned early that privacy was easier to keep than trust. Nights were usually quiet. The wind hit the siding in bursts that sounded like handfuls of gravel. Sometimes a truck passed and the ground hummed for a few seconds. Then the sound drained away and the silence closed again. On clear nights the stars looked close enough to touch. On bad nights the white erased everything. The radio stayed on even when we weren't scheduled. It was habit. Out there, habit mattered. That night the weather shifted fast. Snow went from steady to blinding in less than an hour. The world shrank to the beam of a headlamp and whatever lay inside it. The wind took the rest. The call came after midnight. Static, Then the report. A northbound truck had gone off the road at a mile marker not far from us. No contact with the driver. Last signal showed a sudden stop. That was all. No panic in the transmission. Just absence. I volunteered because I was already layered and because sitting still made my hands shake. The cold did that, but so did waiting. We took a service rig as far as we could. The road vanished under drifts that moved like water when the wind hit them. We parked where it made sense and continued on foot. The truck lay nose down in a drift below the grade, half swallowed. The cab lights were dark. The engine block was cold enough to sting through gloves. The windshield was intact. The doors were shut. The mirrors were folded in, either from the slide or from the drift building around them. It looked like the truck had slipped, corrected, then lost the fight. What didn't fit was the snow. There were no clear footprints leading away from the cab. No wandering tracks, no frantic steps. Instead, there was a wide disturbed area near the driver's side, a sweep in the snow that curved away from the truck and back again. It looked like something heavy had been pulled and turned. The drift around it had started to refill, softening the edges, but the shape remained. We checked the immediate area. Visibility was bad. The wind kept changing direction, wiping clean anything delicate. I moved uphill to look for markers, reflectors, anything that might point toward a path or a shelter. The grade rose steeply there, a ridge cut by plows and weather. My headlamp threw a narrow cone. The snow underfoot squeaked and slid. I heard footsteps above me. They were too slow to be a person. Not dragging, not stumbling. Measured. Each step placed after the last with care. I remember thinking of a moose because of the weight and the sound, but moose move with urgency when they move at all. This matched my pace. When I paused, it paused. When I shifted, it shifted. The wind dropped for a moment, and the quiet pressed in. In that quiet I heard breathing, deep, wet, patient, not strained, not scared. The sound came from somewhere above and to my left, just out of the beam. I angled the lamp up the slope. The light flickered once, dimmed, then steadied. The breathing stopped instantly. That stop mattered more than the sound. It meant attention. It meant whatever was there knew exactly when to be still. I backed down the slope at first, careful not to slip. The snow gave way in sheets. The footsteps followed slower now, as if to keep distance. I turned and went downhill fast. The beam bounced. The wind rose again, erasing sound. I didn't look back because I knew the ridge would give me nothing I could use. I ran until the camp lights cut through the white and burned my eyes. I didn't stop inside. I stood outside until my pulse slowed, and my hands steadied enough to unclip my gloves. The others filled in the report. I added what I could without explaining more than necessary. The truck was recovered later with better weather. The driver was never found. The official report said exposure. That fit the paperwork. It fit the averages. People stepped out of cabs all the time to check damage and lost the road in minutes. Cold closed the gap. I thought about the disturbed snow and the lack of tracks. I thought about the breathing and the way it stopped. I thought about the half circle, the shape of a body dragged and turned, catched away from the wind. A bear had been seen weeks earlier, lean from a long winter, moving along the embankments where the plows exposed salt and grit. An injured bear moved slower. A bear learned patterns. The Dalton was a ribbon of scent and noise in a silent place. Trucks broke down. People stepped out. Mistakes happened. 2 days later I quit. I packed fast and left gear I didn't need. The drive south felt longer than the trip up. The land flattened and opened. Trees returned. The dark eased its grip. I still don't walk near embankments at night. Not because of fear of what I can't see, but because I understand now how quiet patience works. How easily a shape can wait just beyond a beam of light. How the cold can erase the story until only the ending remains. My cousin Mark talked me into it during a winter, when both of us were short on money and long on restlessness. He had watched old tapes from the 70s. Grainy footage of men standing knee-deep in cold creeks, smiling with gold pans in their hands. He believed Alaska still worked that way, if you were willing to work hard and sleep rough. He said placer mining was honest labor. He said we would be far from people and closer to something real. I knew better, but I went anyway. We flew into Fairbanks with too much gear and not enough experience. Everything cost more than we expected. Fuel, food, permits. Even the cheap motel near the airport felt like a drain. Mark stayed excited through all of it. He talked in plans and lists. He had printed maps, hand-drawn notes, and coordinates copied from an old forum post. He believed that staying upriver from active claims would keep us clear of trouble. He believed bears avoided noise, and that hanging food high solved most problems. He believed sleep would come when we were tired enough. The drive north and east took us off pavement, and into gravel that rattled the truck until my teeth felt loose. The land opened wide and flat, then folded into low hills. Black spruce crowded the low ground. The air smelled wet and sharp. The sun hovered high even late in the evening, bleaching the sky instead of darkening it. We passed no other vehicles after the last junction. When we stopped to stretch, the silence pressed close, broken only by insects and the distant rush of water. We set camp near a bend in the creek where the water slowed and widened. The bank was gravel and silt, easy to dig. Alder and willow grew thick along the edges. The mosquitoes were unreal. They coated exposed skin within seconds. Head nets helped but did not stop the sound. The constant high whine followed us everywhere. We worked with sleeves down and gloves on even in warm air. The creek water numbed our hands in minutes. We shoveled gravel into a classifier and washed it down into pans. The work was slow and physical. Bending, lifting, shaking. Gold was scarce. We found flakes small enough to doubt. Mark stayed optimistic. I counted calories in hours. The sun never really left. It slid low, brushed the hills, then climbed again. Shadows stretched but never vanished. Sleep came in fragments. We lay in the tent listening to water and insects and the wind pushing through brush. The nylon glowed faintly orange for hours. My body never settled into rest. My mind stayed alert, scanning sounds. We hung the food cache high between two trees, well away from camp. We followed the rules. Rope, pulleys, distance. The sacks held dried meals, rice, jerky, oatmeal, coffee. We checked it before sleeping each night. The second morning it was torn open. The rope was intact. The branch was intact. The bags themselves were shredded, peeled back as if split by force rather than cut. Packages lay scattered on the ground. Some were crushed flat. Some were gone. There were no claw marks on the tree, no hair stuck in fibers, no scat nearby. The ground beneath showed scuffed gravel but no clear tracks. The creek bank nearby was smooth mud. Nothing obvious crossed it. Mark tried to explain it as a bear that grabbed and twisted, maybe a curious one that learned fast. I had grown up around bears farther south. I had seen damage. This looked wrong. The bags looked pressed and torn, not raked. The opening was wide, not punctured. The smell was wrong too, not sweet or fishy. Something sour hung in the air, like spoiled meat soaked and left out. We repacked what we could salvage into hard containers and moved them farther away. We worked the creek through the day with less focus. Every sound made me look up. Wind and brush felt closer. The mosquitoes thickened as the day warmed. Sweat ran down my back and soaked into my belt. My hands stayed numb from water. That night, exhaustion finally pulled me under for short bursts. I woke often, unsure why. The creek sounded louder. The tent felt smaller. The air inside carried a damp, heavy smell from our clothes and boots. At some point, a new sound joined the background. A slow, deliberate movement through brush. Something heavy circled the tent. It moved with weight, each step sinking and releasing. No snapping branches, no rush. The sound passed along one side, paused, then continued. The ground vibrated faintly. I held my breath without thinking. The fabric wall bowed slightly as air moved around it. My mind reached for bear because that was the only shape it knew. Bear's huff. Bear's snort. Bear's paw and test. This thing stayed quiet. It circled once, then again closer. I smelled it before it touched the tent. Rotten damp fur. A deep, old smell that carried decay and wetness. It did not come in bursts. It settled. The canvas pressed inward. Not slashed, not clawed. Pressed. A steady pressure, as if a shoulder leaned and tested. The tent pole creaked. The fabric stretched tight against it. I felt the shape of mass without detail. The pressure shifted slightly, then held. A gunshot cracked the air. The pressure stopped at once. The fabric relaxed. No crashing retreat followed. No footfalls fading into brush. The sound died and the silence closed in hard. The mosquitoes returned to the tent walls. The creek kept running. We stayed still until our muscles burned. Minutes passed. Nothing moved. When we finally forced ourselves to breathe normally, the smell lingered faintly. It drifted away slowly, carried by the air. We did not sleep after that. We sat with our backs against the tent walls until the light grew stronger and the sun lifted clear of the hills. When we stepped out, the camp looked unchanged. No torn fabric. No blood. No scat. The brush around the tent was flattened in a wide arc, pressed down rather than broken. Near the creek, we found footprints. They were not clear like prints in sand. They were impressions in wet silt and gravel, distorted by water and weight. They ran parallel to the bank, not crossing it. Each print was long, longer than a boot, with a narrow heel and a broad forefoot. The toe area showed pressure points that did not line up with boots or paws. No claw marks. No defined pad. The stride was steady and long. The prints sank deep, deeper than expected for their shape. I measured one with my hand. It spanned from wrist to fingertip and more. The heel area was too narrow for a bear. The front was too spread. The track pattern did not match moose. There were no split hooves. The depth suggested weight far beyond a person. The edges of each impression were smooth, not scuffed. The prints led along the creek for a short distance, then vanished where the bank turned rocky. There was no sign of entry or exit from the water. The mud showed no slide marks. Whatever made them knew the ground and chose it. We packed out that day. We moved fast and careless, stuffing gear and leaving behind what we could not carry. The mosquitoes fed without resistance. Sweat soaked everything. My hands shook as I tied knots. Every sound made me flinch. We took turns watching the brush while the other worked. The creek felt louder than before, as if it carried sound farther. The hike back to the truck stretched longer than it had coming in. The land felt tighter, the trees closer. We stopped often to listen. Nothing followed. Nothing showed itself. The smell did not return. The silence stayed heavy until the road came into view. We drove without stopping until we reached pavement. Only then did my shoulders drop. My jaw ached from clenching. Mark stared out the window, his excitement gone, replaced by a fixed, thoughtful look. He did not speak. He did not need to. Later, back in town, we reported a bear encounter out of caution. The ranger listened, asked questions, and wrote notes. He suggested a large brown bear with unusual behavior, possibly injured or food-conditioned. He said bears can press tents. He said tracks distort in mud. He said the smell could be rot from a carcass. He said Alaska holds many things that feel strange when you are tired and far from home. I accepted the explanation because I needed to. It fit enough to stand on. Bears can be quiet. Bears can learn. Bears can surprise. The prints could have been altered by water and angle. The silence after the shot could mean the animal froze and waited. Still, pieces did not settle. The lack of claws. The steady pressure instead of probing. The way it circled without sound. The way the smell carried old decay rather than fresh kill. The way the tracks stayed near the creek and avoided crossing open ground. The way the food cache was torn rather than ripped. Years later, I read about injured bears with damaged paws that walked strangely. I read about animals that learned to move without noise. I read about miners and hunters misreading signs, because fear sharpens and distorts memory. All of it helped, but none of it erased the feeling of weight leaning into thin fabric, testing without urgency. Mark never jokes about Alaska anymore. He never brings up gold or old tapes. When someone mentions heading north for easy money or adventure, he changes the subject. I do not argue. I remember the smell, the pressure, the prints that did not make sense, and the way the land watched without moving. I moved to Anchorage because remote work finally made it possible. I had spent years telling myself I wanted quiet, that I was tired of traffic noise and police sirens and neighbors arguing through thin walls. Alaska felt like the last place where space still meant something. Snow absorbed sound. Distance mattered. I pictured long mornings with coffee and a laptop, watching weather move across trees instead of buildings. I didn't want an apartment. I wanted separation. I rented a small log cabin about 40 minutes outside the city, far enough that the road stopped getting plowed after heavy snow. The owner handled everything over email. He mentioned the previous tenant had left suddenly, but the place was clean and ready. I didn't ask questions. People leave suddenly all the time. The cabin sat in a clearing cut from black spruce and birch. It had a metal roof, a wood stove, a propane heater, and a single exterior light mounted above the door. There was no fence. Just packed snow where people and animals passed through. Moose tracks crossed the yard regularly, wide and deep. Once, early on, I watched a cow and calf move between the trees at dusk, slow and quiet, steam lifting from their backs. I felt like I had made the right decision. The first weeks were easy, cold but manageable. The sun stayed low. Nights stretched long. I worked during the day, split firewood, learned how to keep the pipes from freezing. I slept well. I saw the northern lights once, green bands shifting slowly overhead. The silence felt earned, like something I had worked toward instead of escaped into. The power went out during a cold snap in early January. The temperature dropped fast, below -20, then lower. I switched to the wood stove and propane, shut off anything electrical that didn't matter. Outages weren't rare. The owner had warned me. Still, the cabin felt different without the hum of power lines. Sound carried more. Every small noise stood out. That night I heard scratching on the exterior logs. It came from the north wall, the side without windows. Slow, uneven scraping, like something dragging across rough wood. It stopped when I stood up. I turned on the interior lights and waited. Nothing. I told myself it was an animal. Porcupines gnaw on wood. Squirrels climb everywhere. I went back to bed. It happened again the next night. Same place, same pattern. Scratching for a minute or two, then silence when I moved. I didn't see anything outside when I checked. Snow lay smooth against the wall. No fresh tracks. The sound didn't come from the roof or the door. It stayed low, close to the ground. Over the next week, the scratching became routine. It never lasted long. It never happened during the day. It always stopped when I moved or turned on lights. I started keeping the interior lights off and listening, sitting still on the couch with my coat on, breath fogging in the cold air. The sound traveled along the logs, moving a few feet, then stopping. I couldn't place it. It didn't match any animal noise I knew. One morning I found frost patterns on the living room window that didn't make sense. Handprints stood out where the glass had been warmed and then refrozen. The shape was clear enough to see palms and fingers. They were large, wider than my hands, fingers straight and evenly spaced, like someone wearing thick gloves. They were placed too high for a child. I wiped them away and stood there longer than I needed to. I checked the snow outside. Wind had drifted it smooth against the cabin. No tracks. No sign of anyone walking up to the window. The nearest house was half a mile down the road. I had passed it once on foot. No one had been outside. I told myself the prints could have been mine, distorted by temperature changes. I hadn't pressed my hands there, but memory is unreliable. Cold does strange things to glass. I moved on with my day. I mentioned the noises to a neighbor when I ran into him at the mailboxes. He said it was probably kids or animals, that people underestimated how far sound traveled in winter. He shrugged and went back to his truck. I stood there watching exhaust disappear into the air. The power came back briefly, then went out again. The cold settled in deeper. I started sleeping in short stretches. The cabin popped and shifted as temperatures changed. Ice formed along the inside edges of the windows. Every sound pulled me awake. The scratching returned heavier now. Not just scraping but pressure, like weight leaning in and sliding. It stayed on the north wall. It never circled the cabin. It never touched the door. It felt deliberate, focused. I tried recording it on my phone, but the sound barely came through, lost in static and the crackle of the stove. One night I heard knocking. 3 knocks, slow, evenly spaced, then a pause, then 3 more, not loud, not urgent. The sound came from the door. I sat frozen on the couch, lights off, heart pounding hard enough to make my chest ache. I didn't move. I didn't make noise. I waited for a voice, for footsteps, for anything that made sense. Nothing followed. Just silence, thick and heavy. The knocking happened again the next night. Same pattern. Same pause. I watched the door from across the room, the handle still, the frame dark. I could hear my own breathing. I didn't answer. I didn't approach it. By then, I had started noticing small things. The snow near the north wall stayed packed down longer than elsewhere, even after fresh snowfall. The exterior light flickered once, then burned out. I found marks on the logs, shallow gouges that looked like they had been made with something hard and narrow. Not teeth, not claws. I checked my cell service. Weak but usable. I started leaving the cabin during the day, driving into town to work from cafes, staying longer than necessary. I delayed going back until dark forced me to. The last night came after a full day of heavy cold, the kind that drains sound from the air. I arrived just after dusk. The cabin felt wrong the moment I stepped inside. The air smelled different, stale, like damp clothing left too long. I checked every room, every corner. Nothing was out of place. The knocking started after midnight. 3 knocks, pause. 3 knocks. Again. Louder this time. Closer. The door shuddered slightly with each impact. I stayed where I was, sitting on the floor with my back against the couch, eyes locked on the door. I didn't shout. I didn't move. I waited. The sound went on for hours. Not constant, but patient. Knocking. Leaning. Pressure against the door, then release. The frame creaked. Wood protested under slow force. Whoever was outside never tried the handle. Never broke glass. Just leaned, rested, knocked again. At some point, I realized the scratching on the north wall had been a person using something metal, testing the logs, staying out of sight. I realized the handprints had been left by someone standing on packed snow, leaning forward, watching me through the glass. I realized the knocking wasn't meant to get me to open the door quickly. It was meant to wear me down. Morning came gray and flat. The sound stopped just before dawn. I didn't sleep. When I finally stood and approached the door, light seeped through cracks that hadn't been there before. The frame bowed inward. Hairline fractures ran through the wood, compressed by steady weight over time. Outside, the snow told the rest of the story. A wide packed area sat directly in front of the door, footprints layered over each other, pacing marks worn deep. The prints were large, booted, heavy. They led away toward the trees, then vanished where wind had erased them. I didn't call the owner. I didn't talk to neighbors. I packed what I could fit into my car and left before the road softened. Later, in town, I learned about people who lived off, grid deeper in the woods, seasonal workers who lost housing, men who drifted when winter closed in. Some stayed close to warmth. Some watched cabins for weeks before approaching. I moved back south within a month. The cabin stayed quiet after I left. I don't know who leaned against my door that night. I know they knew the cold as well as I did. I know they were patient. That was enough. My brother wanted his first caribou. I wanted him to grow up already. He was 19, tall in a way that still looked unfinished. Like the height had come before the weight and the confidence. He had spent the winter watching videos and reading forums, convinced that a single hunt would turn him into something steadier. I had already lived long enough in Alaska to know that the land did not offer lessons on demand. It offered consequences. Still, I agreed to go. He needed someone with more hours outside, someone who could keep things controlled. That was the word I kept using. Controlled. We flew out of Fairbanks in a bush plane that rattled like loose bones. The pilot was older than both of us combined, thin, quiet, his eyes always moving. He landed us on a strip of gravel scraped out of the tundra by a mining crew years earlier. It barely deserved to be called a strip. No markers, no windsock, just a stretch of flattened ground surrounded by open land that rolled away in every direction. The pilot unloaded our gear, reminded us of the pickup window, 6 days if weather allowed, earlier if it turned bad. Then the plane lifted, and the sound disappeared faster than I expected. Silence came down hard after that. The tundra in late summer looks empty until you spend time in it. Then you notice how much is happening close to the ground. The moss shifts under your boots. The earth gives and springs back. Water hides everywhere, shallow pools covered in grass that looks solid until you step wrong. The horizon never feels close. It keeps its distance no matter how long you walk. We set camp on slightly higher ground near a shallow drainage. No trees. Just low brush and rocks. We pitched the tent tight and low, anchored it with stones. We stashed food downwind sealed, weighted clean. I checked everything twice. My brother watched and nodded, eager, impatient. He wanted to glass ridges to move, to feel like he was doing something. I wanted him to slow down. The first 2 days passed without much to mark them. We hiked, we glassed, we spotted caribou far out, moving lines of brown across the gray-green land. Always out of range, always drifting. The wind never settled. Sleep came in short stretches. The light never really left, just faded enough to remind you that time was still moving. On the third day, we were back near camp, breaking down a short stalk that hadn't worked. The caribou had shifted direction without warning, flowing around a low rise and vanishing. We stood there longer than we should have, watching empty land, trying to convince ourselves they might reappear. That was when we heard it. At first it sounded like someone calling across a distance, long vowels stretched thin, rising and falling. The sound came from far enough away that it flattened against the land, hard to place. It moved with the wind, but didn't scatter the way a bird call would. It had weight. I felt the shift in my chest before my mind caught up. There were no other camps within miles. No roads. No trails. No reason for a person to be out there calling like that. My brother reacted before I could reach him. He lifted his head and answered. A reflex. A sound shaped by years of hearing his name called across fields and parking lots. His voice carried farther than he expected. I saw the surprise on his face as the sound left him and went into the open. The response came back faster this time. Closer. The rhythm was wrong. The pitch slid in places where it shouldn't have. The vowels dragged too long, then cut off too sharp. It sounded like someone practicing speech, not speaking, like a mouth testing shapes it didn't use often. We stood still. The tundra has a way of making movement feel loud even when it isn't. My pulse felt heavy in my ears. I scanned the ground, the ridges, the dips where someone could crouch. There was nothing to see. The land looked the same as it always had. Open, empty. The calling stopped as suddenly as it had started. The silence afterward felt pressed down thick. I told myself it could have been wind moving through something hollow, or a bird carrying sound strangely. I didn't believe it. But I needed a reason that didn't lead anywhere worse. We walked back to camp without speaking. My brother kept looking over his shoulder, then catching himself and facing forward again. His pace was faster than it had been all week. That night the wind dropped. The tent fabric barely moved. The light dimmed but never went away. I lay on my back, listening to the small sounds inside the tent, the shifting of gear, my brother's breathing, uneven and shallow. Something brushed the outside of the tent. It was light at first, a drag along the fabric that could have been wind, except there was no wind. I held my breath. The sound came again, higher this time, near where the tent curved toward the peak. Then the outline appeared. The fabric bowed inward slightly, pressed from the outside. I could see the shape clearly in the dim light. Tall, thin. The head rose higher than it should have if it were a person standing close. The shoulders were narrow. No gear, no pack. Just a long vertical shape, close enough that the tent wall felt too thin. It didn't move for a long time. The shape stayed there, steady, as if whatever it was had settled into position. I watched the outline the way you watch a crack in ice, waiting for it to spread. My brother lay frozen beside me. I could feel the tension in his body through the ground. I thought about reaching for the rifle and decided against it. The sound of the zipper would be too loud. Any movement would change whatever balance existed in that moment. Eventually the pressure eased. The fabric relaxed. The shape withdrew without sound. I listened until my ears hurt. Nothing followed. No footsteps. No brush moving. Just the low, constant presence of the land. Morning came without relief. The light looked the same as it always had. The tundra stretched out unchanged. We stepped out of the tent slowly. There were no tracks. The ground was too soft, too uneven, broken by moss and rock. Whatever had stood there had left no clear mark. The satellite phone was gone. We kept it in a dry bag, clipped to a loop inside the tent. The clip was still there. The bag was not torn. It hadn't fallen. It hadn't been crushed. It was simply missing. That was when the weight of the situation settled fully. No phone, no plane until pickup, weather already shifting. Wind building from the west, carrying a smell of rain. We packed fast, not efficiently, not carefully. Fast. I checked the sky, the horizon every few minutes. My brother moved like he was underwater, hands shaking, eyes unfocused. The eagerness he had arrived with was gone. Something else had taken its place, something quieter and heavier. The weather closed in by midday. Clouds dropped low and thick. The wind cut harder. We moved toward the strip early, planning to signal if the plane came in ahead of schedule. The land felt different now. Every dip looked like a place something could rise from. Every distant shape pulled at my attention. We heard the calling again once, faint and far, carried sideways by the wind. It didn't repeat. I didn't let my brother respond. The plane came sooner than expected. The pilot circled once low, then pulled away. He didn't like what he saw. We moved into open ground and waved until our arms burned. Only then did he commit to the landing. We loaded fast. The pilot's eyes flicked past us, over our shoulders, scanning the horizon. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. The plane lifted and the ground fell away, the strip shrinking into nothing. Back in town, the story settled into something explainable. Something that fit inside the world as we understood it. There were other camps farther out than we realized. Seasonal workers, hunters moving through. People who didn't want to be found. Someone could have followed us, curious, unstable, practicing calls to draw us out. Someone tall, thin, skilled at moving quietly, careful enough to take the phone without leaving a trace. In Alaska, that kind of person exists. More than one. That explanation held. It still does. My brother never hunts anymore. He sold his rifle. He avoids open land. He won't say why. I don't press him. I don't need to. I know what it is like to see the outline of a person where no person should be. To hear a voice shaped wrong. To feel how thin the line is between control and something else. I signed on for a winter contract because the pay was triple and I needed surgery money. That was the whole decision. I did not romanticize it. I did not care about Alaska. I needed a number on a piece of paper to be met before a date circled on a calendar. The recruiter talked about hardship pay and isolation bonuses. I asked about medical coverage and overtime. I signed the form with a pen that barely worked in the cold office. The plant sat on a narrow strip of rock at the edge of a bay that stayed ice-free. because of constant movement and discharge. It was steel-sided, bolted to pilings driven into the seabed. A long dock ran out from the processing floor, with conveyors that rattled day and night. In winter there was no daylight. The sun did not rise enough to matter. The sky stayed dark blue or black. Floodlights turned the snow yellow. The ocean sounded angry even from inside, a constant pressure noise that worked through the walls and into the bones. The plant ran nonstop. 12-hour shifts. The schedule never changed. Days and nights lost meaning. We worked, slept, ate, worked again. The air inside smelled like salt, bleach, diesel, and fish. The floors stayed wet. Hoses ran constantly. Drains gurgled. You learned to walk with short steps and keep your balance. You learned to layer clothing without sweating. Sweat froze fast out there. Housing was a prefab block uphill from the dock. The wind hit it full force. Snow built up against the sides and had to be shoveled away every morning. Inside, the heat clicked on and off. Pipes knocked. I slept hard because my body shut down whenever it could. Dreams were shallow. I woke up with my jaw clenched. The ocean was always there. Even during breaks, even during sleep. When the wind came in from the bay, the sound carried through the metal supports under the dock. It was not crashing waves. It was movement. A repeated surge and pull, like something breathing slow and heavy. I told myself it was water pressure and tide changes. I had worked around docks before. This one felt different because of the scale and the isolation. About 3 weeks in, one worker disappeared mid-shift. He worked trimming on the far line, near the open bay doors. I did not know his name. I knew his face from passing him at the time clock. He was tall and quiet. He wore the same beanie every day. That morning he was there. After lunch, his spot stayed empty. The line kept moving. People rotated to cover it. The supervisor said he quit. No announcement, no slowdown. His boots were still by the locker at shift change, placed neatly like he planned to come back. I noticed the boots because they were dry. Everything else was wet. They stayed there for days. No one touched them. Eventually they were moved to a storage room. The lockers stayed empty. After that, the nights felt heavier. The noise under the dock stood out. It had a rhythm that did not match waves or ice. 3 beats, pause, 3 beats. Sometimes faster, sometimes slow enough to count between breaths. I would stand at the rail during breaks and look down. The water was black. The lights did not reach far. Steam rose where warm discharge met cold air. I never saw anything break the surface. I still heard it. One morning at the start of my shift, I saw footprints on the processing floor. They came from the bay door. They were wet and bare. Toes spread wide. The edges looked wrong. The floor drains pulled water away but left outlines. The prints crossed the floor and stopped near the lockers. I stood there longer than I should have. The supervisor walked past without looking down. The line started. Hoses sprayed. The marks vanished. I told myself it was rubber distortion. Boots warp when wet and cold. Gloves leave strange marks when people walk without thinking. I told myself a lot of things during that contract. That was how you stayed functional. The splashing under the dock continued. It happened most during slack tide, when the water moved but not enough to hide smaller sounds. It sounded like hands hitting metal, then slipping back into water. I knew SEALs used docks. I had seen them in other places. This sounded closer and lower, right under the structure. I did not see whiskers or eyes. I did not see anything. The noise stayed. A week later, maintenance shut down a section of the dock for inspection. Ice buildup and corrosion. I was assigned to help with cleanup afterward. We hosed down the area and cleared debris from the pilings. Under the lowest beam, caught on a bolt, there was a scrap of fabric. It looked like a sleeve from a thermal shirt. The cut edge was clean. The color matched what the missing worker wore under his gear. I pulled it loose and dropped it into a bin without saying anything. The explanation came in pieces, not all at once. The bay had strong currents that ran under the dock. The discharge kept channels open. Seals followed fish. Sea lions followed seals. The pilings were spaced close. If someone fell in, especially at night, the suction from moving water could pin them against metal. Hypothermia took hold fast. Panic made movements clumsy. Boots filled with water and dragged a body down. If the person tried to climb out without boots, wet skin against steel did not hold. Fingers spread wide to grip. The marks on the floor matched hands as much as feet. Webbing was swelling and frostbite, skin pulled tight and pale. Water distorted everything. I did not hear this from a single source. There was no meeting, no report. The plant did not shut down. Work continued. The supervisor's version stayed the same. Quit mid-shift, no paperwork problem. The boots had been placed neatly because he planned to change them before going out on the dock, lighter footwear for ice. He never made it back. After that, I avoided the bay doors. I did my job and went back to housing. The splashing continued. Sometimes it was louder. Sometimes it stopped for days. When storms hit, the sound blended into everything else. When it was calm, it stood alone. I finished my contract. I counted shifts. I packed my bag. The plane landed late because of weather. I did not look back at the dock when we lifted off. The bay looked calm from the air, a dark plate with faint lines of movement. My surgery went fine. The money covered it. Recovery took months. Pain came and went. Sleep returned to normal. Most of the time. I still dream about water moving against metal supports. In the dream, the sound is clear and measured. I know what causes it. I know the physics. I know the biology. That knowledge does not stop my body from waking up tense, fingers spread, searching for something solid that is not slick with cold. I joined the survey crew because I trusted maps more than people. Lines, coordinates, elevation notes, bearing checks. All of it made sense. Timber boundaries were clean work, compared to exploration or prospecting. You knew what you were looking for before you stepped off the road. The state contract paid by the mile and by the day, not by findings, which mattered. No incentive to invent problems. Just measure, mark, and move on. There were 3 of us. We carried light packs, aluminum stakes, flagging tape, GPS units, paper maps sealed in waterproof sleeves, compasses, and a shared tent we rarely used. We leapfrogged markers and camped wherever the light died. Late summer in interior Alaska stretches the day thin but long. The ground stayed soft. The air stayed wet. Everything smelled like sap and soil and old leaves that never fully dried. The job area sat north of a river bend, far from any maintained road. A helicopter dropped us near an old cut line that had not been used in years. From there, we moved on foot. The forest was dense but orderly. Spruce and birch grew where the soil allowed. Fallen trees lay where storms had taken them. Nothing felt altered. Even clearings followed logic. Fire scars, old blowdowns, beaver activity near creeks. Patterns existed if you paid attention. The first 2 days went as expected. We verified existing markers, replaced faded tape, logged coordinates, and corrected minor drift from older surveys done before modern GPS accuracy. Human error showed itself in small ways. A stake driven a foot off, a bearing slightly skewed by iron in the soil. Nothing alarming. Nothing worth reporting beyond routine notes. On the 3rd day, we reached a boundary corner that did not align with our data. The marker stood in the wrong place. Not shifted by erosion or frost heave. It had been pulled and reset. The ground around it showed fresh cuts, clean edges, no rot. The soil had not settled yet. Markers go missing. People collect them. Animals chew tape. That happens. Relocation does not. Nobody moves a survey marker unless they are trying to change a line. We checked the coordinates twice. The GPS agreed with the map. The map agreed with the previous survey. The marker disagreed with all of it. We documented the discrepancy. Photos, notes, measurements. We set a temporary stake at the correct location and flagged both points. Then we followed the disturbed ground. Whoever moved it had dragged the stake rather than carrying it. The trail was faint but visible to anyone trained to read ground. Bent grass. Broken twigs. A scrape where the metal edge had caught stone. The trail did not follow a straight line. It curved, avoided thick brush, crossed a shallow drainage, then climbed. That bothered me. Most people move directly when they are doing something wrong. This path showed familiarity. Someone knew how to travel without leaving too much behind. The forest began to change as we moved. Not in species or density, but in posture. Trees leaned inward, not fallen, bent. Their trunks bowed toward a central point as if pressure had been applied slowly over time. Roots showed stress without full exposure. No sign of wind throw. No directional fall pattern. The canopy thickened overhead while the ground thinned beneath our boots. The clearing appeared without warning. One step forward and the forest stopped. Not thinned. Not transitioned. Stopped. The space was roughly circular, large enough to park several trucks, though no tracks existed. The ground was compacted. Not bare but pressed. Moss flattened. Soil hardened. Trees at the edge leaned inward, their lower branches snapped, not cut. Brakes were high enough to suggest force rather than tools. No stumps. No sawdust. No drag marks from logs. Nothing removed. Nothing added. Just bent and broken growth forming a bowl. I felt watched the moment I stepped into it. Not the kind of fear that tightens the chest. Something steadier. A sense of being measured. Like standing under a camera you cannot see. My breathing stayed even. My hands stayed steady. My attention sharpened without panic. We did not speak. We moved the way crews do when something is wrong but not yet defined, slow. Methodical. Eyes up. Notes taken. Measurements checked. We circled the perimeter. Bearings showed no magnetic anomaly. The GPS units held signal. Elevation matched surrounding terrain. At the center the soil was darker. Damp without standing water. Pressed deeper than the rest. No footprints. No tire marks. Just compression. I knelt and pressed my palm into the ground. It resisted. Not frozen. Not rocky. Packed. Like a trail used repeatedly by weight spread wide. I stood and looked at the trees again. The breaks were old enough to have weathered edges, but not old enough to have healed. Months, not years. No animal sign explained it. Moose break branches but leave tracks. Bears tear, not bend. Wind snaps tops, not curves trunks inward from all sides. Snow load pushes down, not toward a center. We documented everything. Photos from multiple angles. Measurements of lean angles. Soil hardness. Moisture levels. We marked the clearing on our maps as an anomaly, flagged the perimeter lightly, and returned the way we came. The sense followed us out. Not pursuit, observation. Like pressure easing as distance increased. That night, we camped near a creek. Clear sky. No rain. The temperature dropped but stayed above freezing. I slept lightly, waking often, not from noise but from alertness. Nothing happened. No sounds beyond water and insects. No movement beyond wind in the canopy. In the morning we broke camp and continued our route. The forest returned to normal posture. Straight trunks, natural clearings, predictable ground. When we stopped to log data at midday, I opened my map sleeve to update notes. The paper inside was soaked. Not damp. Saturated. Ink had bled across lines, turning precise boundaries into blurred shapes. The waterproof sleeve was sealed. No punctures. No condensation buildup visible. The others checked theirs. Same condition. Every map, every notebook, wet through. The GPS units were dry. Packs were dry. Sleeping gear dry. Food dry. Only paper affected. We spread the maps in the sun. The ink continued to run as if water remained within the fibers. Notes from the previous days dissolved into stains. Coordinates became illegible. Photos still existed on the cameras, but the written record was gone. We retraced our steps mentally. No rain. No river crossing deep enough to breach seals. No spill. No submersion. Nothing explained selective saturation. We continued working, relying on digital backups and memory, but the rhythm was broken. Every tree line looked altered. Every marker felt suspect. The sense of evaluation returned intermittently, strongest near dense growth, weakest in open areas. When we finished the contract segment and returned to base, we filed our report. Photos attached, GPS logs included. Notes reconstructed as best as possible. The relocated marker and clearing were flagged for follow-up, The supervisor reviewed the materials and dismissed the concerns. Animal interference, freeze-thaw effects, unusual but not unprecedented forest behavior, paper damage attributed to condensation or user error. The clearing was labeled an old blowdown distorted by soil movement. I accepted the explanation outwardly. On paper, it worked. Privately, it did not. Weeks later, I requested reassignment to office work. By winter, I left fieldwork entirely. Months after that, I learned through an internal bulletin that the area had been quietly removed from active survey rotation. No reason given. No public notice. Timber boundaries adjusted slightly, favoring no one. I still think about the clearing, about the relocated marker, about the careful path that led there. I do not believe in unknown forces or hidden creatures. I believe in people, equipment, and intent. Someone had been using that space, repeatedly, carefully, with heavy machinery moved in ways that avoided tracks. Pressure applied slowly to bend growth rather than cut it. Markers shifted to redraw lines without drawing attention. Maps compromised without damaging gear. The feeling of being evaluated fits with that. Not hunted, assessed. We were variables entering a controlled area. Watched to determine response. When the paper failed, it removed the most immediate threat. A permanent record. The forest did not do that. People did. Leaving fieldwork was easy after that. Trust, once bent, does not straighten. I went alone because I always do. Photography trips work better that way. No compromises, no waiting, no explaining why I stop every few minutes to stare at light moving across leaves. I wanted fall colors before the snow buried everything. Late September in Alaska gives you that narrow window where the land looks alive and tired at the same time. Birch turning yellow, alder going dull red, spruce still dark and heavy. The air sharp enough to wake you up but not yet cruel. I parked at a wide pullout off a gravel road that didn't have a name, just a mile marker bent sideways and half shot through. No other vehicles. That wasn't unusual. The road itself was used enough to be firm and washed smooth in places. Logging traffic. Hunters, locals cutting through. I checked my camera gear, locked the car, and stepped into the trees. The trail wasn't marked, but it was worn. Not game worn, human worn. Boots had pressed the soil flat, snapped small branches, scuffed roots clean of moss. It followed a low ridge, then dipped toward a creek I could hear before I saw. The trail felt recent. The ground hadn't rebounded yet. Leaves pushed aside instead of settled. I noticed that because I always do. Paying attention is the whole point of being out there. I moved slow, stopping often. Light filtered through the canopy in narrow sheets. Every angle looked like it could turn into something worth keeping. I took photos of bark patterns, of frost clinging to grass in shaded pockets, of a crow feather caught in a spider web. Time stretched the way it does when you're alone and focused. I didn't check my watch. The creek cut through a shallow draw and smelled like cold stone. I followed it upstream for a while, stepping carefully across slick rocks. On the far side, the trail picked up again, clearer now, wider. Someone had dragged something heavy along it recently. The ground showed a faint trail, leaves crushed into the dirt. I assumed a sled or a pack frame. It didn't bother me yet. Plenty of people use unmarked trails for reasons they don't share. The camp came into view without warning. I expected an old fire ring or a scatter of trash. Instead, I found a small, neat setup tucked under spruce boughs. A low tarp shelter pulled tight between trees. A fire pit with ash still dark and clumped, not yet broken down by weather. A pot sitting near the edge lit on, warmth still rising when I held my hand above it. Food was inside. Not freeze-dried wrappers or old cans. Real food. Bread sealed in plastic. Mate wrapped and set near the creek to stay cool. A water bottle half full, condensation on the sides. The place wasn't abandoned. Someone had stepped away. I froze in place and listened. The woods were quiet in that way that isn't calm. No birds. No wind through the higher branches. I could hear my own breathing, the soft mechanical sound of blood in my ears. I looked for signs of someone nearby. Boot prints led away from the camp toward higher ground. They were sharp, edges clean. Fresh. I backed away the way I'd come, slow, careful not to snap anything. I didn't want to announce myself. I didn't want to explain why I was there. I told myself it was probably a hunter glassing a ridge, or someone checking traps. Still, the warmth of that food stayed with me. It meant minutes, not hours. I turned back toward the trail and started moving faster, no longer stopping for photos. My focus narrowed to footing and direction. The woods felt different now, tighter. Every shadow looked deeper. I kept my camera stowed and my hands free. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. They were measured, steady, not rushed. Each step matched my pace without gaining. I stopped. The sound stopped. I moved again. It followed. Leaves crunching softly, boots careful but not hiding. Whoever it was knew how to move without panicking the woods. I didn't turn around. Turning around gives things weight. I kept walking, heart climbing into my throat. I angled off the trail once, then cut back. The steps adjusted without hesitation. They stayed behind me, never closer, never farther. Just present. I thought about running. Running makes noise. Running makes mistakes. I stayed controlled, breathing through my nose, scanning for landmarks. I needed the creek again. Water gives direction. The trail bent downhill, and I followed it, boots slipping on damp soil. The steps stayed with me, patient. At the creek I crossed without stopping, water soaking into my cuffs. I climbed the opposite bank and kept going. My legs burned. I wanted to look back, I didn't. The sound of following feet stayed constant. Not playful, not aggressive, evaluating. I reached a stand of birch where the trees thinned and the light opened up. Wind moved through the leaves, masking sound. For a moment I couldn't hear the steps. I told myself that meant they were gone. Then the sound returned on the far side of the birch, same distance, same pace. I didn't carry a weapon. I carried lenses and extra batteries and a first aid kit. I had bear spray clipped to my pack strap, but this wasn't a bear. Bears don't follow like that. Bears close distance or break off. The trail eventually widened and leveled out. I knew I was close to the road. Relief crept in, fragile and dangerous. I could smell dust and oil. I pushed harder, no longer hiding my movement. The footsteps stayed behind me until the trees thinned enough that I could see daylight through them. I stepped out into the clearing where my car sat alone. The gravel was undisturbed except for one fresh set of boot prints circling the vehicle. My door was closed. Nothing looked broken. I unlocked it with shaking hands and climbed in. The hood of the car was warm. Not sun warm, hand warm, recently touched. I didn't check anything else. I started the engine and pulled out, tires throwing gravel. I watched the tree line in the mirror until the road curved and took it out of sight. No one stepped out, no movement. That was worse. I drove south without stopping. I didn't slow for scenery. I didn't pull over to calm down. My hands cramped around the wheel. My thoughts replayed every step, every sound. I told myself the person might have been checking my car, worried about a stranger near their camp. I told myself it could have been coincidence. The explanations felt thin. When I reached pavement and saw other vehicles, my breathing finally eased. I didn't stop until I reached a town with lights and noise, and people who didn't look at me twice. Later, at home, I downloaded the photos. They were good. The light was right. The colors were honest. In a few frames, things stood out that I hadn't noticed at the time. A shape between trees that didn't belong to bark or shadow. A boot toe at the edge of a creek reflection. A dark figure blurred by depth of field, always behind where I'd been standing. The photos explained the footsteps, the camp, the warm hood. Someone had been there the whole time, watching, choosing not to be seen clearly, testing how I moved, how I reacted. They touched my car to make sure it would start. They followed without intent to rush because they didn't need to. I don't post those photos. I keep them backed up in one place and nowhere else. I still go alone, but I don't go back there. Some places aren't empty. Some people don't want to be found.